So I will get us all started today. Good morning and welcome to today's talk, brought to you today by the Global Justice Center and the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect. I'm Jocelyn Getchin-Kestenbaum, and I am Associate Professor of Clinical Law at the Cardozo Law School. I also direct the Cardozo Law Institute in Holocaust and Human Rights and the Benjamin B. Ferencz Human Rights and Atrocity Prevention Clinic. And I'm really excited to be here today for Preventing Atrocities with a Women, Peace, and Security Perspective, a Myanmar case study. Before we begin, I want to just take a moment to acknowledge that New York City is situated in Lenape-Hoking, the homeland of the Lenape peoples. We pay respect to the Lenape peoples past, present, and future, and their continuing presence in the homeland. Today, we are going to have a very interesting discussion on the occasion of the 15th anniversary of the adoption of the Responsibility to Protect, or R2P, as well as the 20th anniversary of the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security. The UN Secretary General's annual report on R2P analyzed where issues related to gender and R2P overlap, from identifying risk factors for atrocity crimes to the prevention and response to such crimes. And as highlighted in the report, gender permeates genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing in many ways. For example, during atrocity situations, perpetrators often plan and augment their strategies according to gender of their victims in order to maximize the impact on target populations. Moreover, risk factors for atrocity crimes are also gendered. One reliable predictor of whether a country will experience violent civil unrest or international conflict is the prevalence of violence against women and girls. The case of Myanmar highlights the value of closely examining the gendered dimensions of a particular situation. The country's military, the Tatmadaw, has for decades employed sexual and gender-based violence against ethnic communities as a weapon of terror and of war. Indeed, the UN Human Rights Council mandated independent international fact-finding mission on Myanmar found that sexual and gender-based violence was a hallmark, quoted, of the Tatmadaws' operations against the Rohingya, Shan, and Kachin ethnic communities. With respect to the Rohingya, the prevalence of sexual violence was so high that the fact-finding mission determined that it indicated genocidal intent. Myanmar's government has also restricted the reproductive and marital rights of the Rohingya ethnic group as part of the systematic persecution of this ethnic minority that ultimately led to the genocide. Nevertheless, a gender gap remains in the development, in the assessment, and in the implementation of atrocity prevention frameworks. In identifying situations where the risk of atrocity crimes where there is risk of atrocity crimes, analysis often fails to include gender-specific variables or key indicators on the range of specific threats facing women, girls, and people of minority sexual orientations and gender identities. When gender is included, it is often by grouping women and children as a particularly vulnerable group, and that's a patronizing perspective that ignores the many ways gender permeates mass atrocity crimes and the many roles that women and girls play in prevention, response, and even perpetration of crimes. As this year's R2P report reflects, the international community must do more to ensure a holistic, consistent, and gender-inclusive approach to atrocity prevention and response. Today, I'm joined by international experts and advocates who will discuss how gender permeates every stage of mass atrocity crimes through the lens of the Myanmar context and the role that gender can play in fulfilling the duty to prevent such harm. And here to lead the discussion are Karen Smith, the UN Secretary General's Special Advisor on the Responsibility to Protect, Savita Pandey, Deputy Executive Director of the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect, Akila Radhakrishnan, President of the Global Justice Center, Man Nai Lee, Spokesperson, Advocacy and Information Officer of the Kachin Women's Association. I'm so excited to have this panel discussion today. We're going to begin with some questions and answers that we've prepared and have a conversation. And then we'll be monitoring the question and answer in the chat throughout. So send in your questions when you have them. We will take the time to collate those questions and at the end, take the time to answer your questions from the audience. Savita, I want to start with a question to you. At its inception, conversations around the responsibility to protect, or R2P, and atrocity prevention seemed to be, quote unquote, gender blind. What has changed in the last 15 years?
Thank you, Jocelyn, and good morning, everybody. As a co-host, I would like to begin by welcoming everybody to this panel and looking forward to a really interesting discussion. So to answer your question, Jocelyn, the first few years after R2P was adopted in 2005, advocates of R2P and others within the atrocity prevention community were deeply engaged in developing consensus around the norm and in building institutional mechanisms for its implementation. With the help of the annual reports of the UN Secretary General and the work of organizations like mine, our priority was translating what it actually means to implement R2P. We were focused on understanding how to create and sharpen early warning mechanisms for atrocity crimes and ways in which we can mobilize action to protect populations at the risk of atrocity crimes. Our job was to constantly reinforce the fact that R2P was essentially about prevention, that it is not about the use of force, and that atrocities can happen anywhere because no state is immune, and to emphasize that every state needs to look inwards to build mechanisms to mitigate risk of atrocity crimes. So when the questions of gender came up, the reaction was often to focus exclusively on how sexual and gender-based violence disproportionately affected women and girls. Rape, sexual slavery, forced prostitution, forced pregnancy, forced abortion, and forced sterilization, forced birth control, forced marriage, and any other form of sexual violence of comparable gravity uniquely affect women and girls. ICTY and ICTR, after genocides in Yugoslavia and Rwanda, have recognized that sexual and gender-based violence is a war crime. Additionally, there has been a recognition of the fact, primarily because of the voices of victims and survivors and advocates, on the issue that sexual violence, including rape, is not just a byproduct of war, but has been increasingly employed as a deliberate strategy by state and non-state actors to retaliate against, terrorize, intimidate, control, and displace civilians. And that such acts may amount to crimes against humanity, war crimes, or genocide. The crimes committed against the Yazidi, the Rohingya, and the Uyghur women are a case in point. What the conversations really lacked was a nuanced discussion or an attempt to unpack how atrocity crimes like displacement, torture, execution, and forced disappearances affected women differently, or on the various roles that women play in preventing and responding to atrocity crimes, as you just also mentioned. Further, even within the sexual violence conversation, there was a gap in addressing how such crimes can significantly exacerbate and prolong situations of armed conflict, destroy the social fabric of communities, and impede peace building and reconciliation efforts. And let's be honest, those of us who work in different agenda issues like R2P, WPS, peacekeeping, other protection agendas, work in silos, and it takes concerted and conscious work to actually break those silos. But over the last few years, especially in the context of the work that my organization does on particular country situations, the value of gendered analysis has become crucial. From early warning to response, a gendered approach is important in not only understanding who is vulnerable and why, but what kind of strategies are needed to protect all populations, men, women, boys, and girls. For example, in Nigeria, Boko Haram, which is against Western education, has in the past specifically targeted schools for attack, often focusing on schools for girls. Most notably was the abduction of 270 girls from a government school in Chibok in 2014, which prompted the infamous global hashtag Bring Back Our Girls social media campaign. But this was not an isolated attack on schools for girls in the region. The Taliban has similarly committed atrocities against women and girls to undermine their access to education. So to ignore sex disaggregated variables in these situations, or to focus only on sexual violence as the crimes that disproportionately affect women and girls, misses the key dimension of the conflict. So beyond recognizing the ways that analytical capacity can be enhanced through examining gendered variables, the other strong linkages made between R2P, atrocity prevention, and advancing commitments of WPS over the past few years has come through working with survivors and women organizations within affected communities. Women play an essential role in articulating the needs of their communities in peace processes and even prevention. My organization has been working to improve threat assessments done in the field by UN peacekeepers through the inclusion of the atrocity prevention lens. And in these settings, we know that having a direct dialogue with women in the community helps us in identifying where the greatest emerging risks are. So, I mean, through the years and through all of this learning that we have done by breaking the silos, and this is a very important point between R2P, WPS, peacekeeping community, we have effectively increased the effectiveness of how we holistically provide protection. So that's where I would say we have come in the past 15 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Savita. Very, very interesting. Karen, I want to follow up with you because I want to get your thoughts specifically on the Secretary General's latest report. While the importance of gender equality has been made evident in the United Nations and global agendas in the recent years, the link among gender, the responsibility to protect, and atrocity crimes prevention has been more implicit. This year's report by the Secretary General, however, places an explicit focus on the connection between gender and atrocity crimes prevention and response. And I was wondering, how do you think a gender perspective can enhance the abilities of states, regional organizations, and other actors to better implement their responsibility to protect obligations toward protecting populations from atrocity crimes?
Thanks very much, Jocelyn. I'd like to just start by saying that it's a great pleasure to be part of this virtual event and to have the opportunity to engage with everyone on the theme of gender and atrocity prevention, with a focus, of course, on Myanmar. To your question, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's been a lot of discussion about gender within the Women, Peace and Security and other agendas at the UN, but there hasn't been a lot of explicit discussion about how this relates to the responsibility to protect. And you know, while we've seen a lot of discussion about this in the scholarship, so, you know, people like Sarah Davies, Sarah Tate, Elise Stamnis, and others have been writing about this for more than a decade. And there have been references, I would say, in most of the previous Secretary General reports on R2P. We thought it was time to really produce a report that has a specific focus on this, of course, also given the significance of this year for the women's agenda. Now, as you and Savita have already emphasized, I think it's important to start by, again, just underlining that all four of the atrocity crimes and violations associated with the responsibility to protect can have a gendered impact. And in particular, again, building on the examples that Savita has shared with us, women and girls are often disproportionately affected by, for example, trafficking, sexual slavery, forced prostitution, rape, and other forms of widespread and systematic and gender-based violence. And so when we recognize this is really, really important to helping us gain a better understanding of the kind of dynamics of atrocities. And, you know, this then, of course, will also help us to develop a gendered response to the risks of atrocities. And also, and very importantly, and I think we'll talk more about this, integrating women's perspectives into the process for prevention. Now, you know, to give some specific examples, and this is, again, these are examples from the report, at the national level, this could mean that member states should mainstream gender into their early warning systems, Of course, this also applies at the regional level, and also in the response systems by using gender-sensitive indicators, as Savita has already mentioned as well, but also importantly by collecting sex disaggregated data. And again, I want to underline this, by ensuring the equal and meaningful participation of women in all of this. And so really, the bottom line is that, you know, we shouldn't just be paying attention to women's rights, women's equality, because that's what we should be doing in any case. But there's this added value, I think, to saying that, you know, we know based on the research that has been done that atrocity prevention will ultimately be more effective if it is approached in a more inclusive and a gender-sensitive manner.
Thank you, Karen. Akila, I want to turn to you as someone engaging with civil society on the ground in several different contexts. Prevention is one of the explicit pillars of the Women, Peace, and Security agenda, and yet the area where there's been the least amount of progress. What do you think needs to happen to prevent conflict and mass atrocities, and how does this need to be informed by a gender perspective?
Thanks so much, Jocelyn. You know, this topic is one that's really close to GJC's heart as an organization that works on gender equality on the WPS agenda and on issues like justice and accountability for mass atrocities. So, you know, so let's start with the good, right? And I think Savita and Karen have highlighted where this is. There's been good progress on the protection pillar of WPS, and in the protection pillars more generally of starting to recognize and understand how gender informs the commission of mass atrocities. I think where this has come at the detriment, though, is of some of the other pillars of WPS, particularly prevention and participation, where we've seen little progress. But I do think that the melding of WPS with R2P, which is largely focused on prevention, presents an opportunity to really help bridge this gap. And so as our starting point, and you said it right at the top, Jocelyn, is that gender equality is an important predictor of conflict and atrocities. In the book that that came out in 2012 that we've all looked at, Sex and World Peace, the authors famously found that the larger the gender gap between the treatment of men and women in a society, the more likely a country is to be involved in inter and interstate conflict, to be the first to resort to force in such conflicts, and to resort to higher levels of violence. And so I thought it might actually be helpful to unpack a little bit and think about gender equality, because I think it helps us understand what a more comprehensive approach to conflict and atrocity prevention looks like. And so first, I think prevention efforts need to focus on the root causes of conflict. And here that means tackling the pre-existing structures that tolerate gender-based violence and gender equality. And, you know, it's important. We don't need to reinvent the wheel here. Finding legal frameworks like CEDAW and other human rights treaties provide a blueprint for how to eliminate discrimination and achieve equality. And in this way, full implementation of human rights obligations and the achievement of gender equality should really be considered a powerful bulwark against conflict and mass atrocities. And this, to me, means everything from work on women's economic empowerment to their bodily autonomy and access to the full range of sexual and reproductive health services, including safe abortion, to the prevention of gender-based violence. These are all important steps in preventing conflict and mass atrocity. Second, I think we do need to spend some time, and I'm going to get a little specific here, drilling down into improving our early warning and gender prevention tools. As Savita laid out, there's kind of been a little bit of the history of the development of these has been gender blind and perhaps not fully integrated. So in some of our work, we've looked in detail at what some of these look like. And so, for example, in 2014, the UN Office on the Prevention of Genocide released its framework of analysis for atrocity crimes. And the framework, despite having a detailed breakdown of indicia evidencing, common risk factors, fails to discuss how different violations may target male or female victims differently, or could be motivated, for example, by gender-based discrimination on factors such as sexual identity, expression, and orientation. And there's also very little attempt to differentiate how early warning systems might manifest themselves in the form of gendered harms. And so I'll give an example, and Jocelyn, you alluded to this earlier, in the fact that in those, women are always grouped with children, which infantilizes them and reduces them to a category of individuals in need of protection. And in some ways, some of the ways that the factors are phrased are also a bit reductive and reinforce patriarchal notions of gender. For example, risk factor 10 only contemplates policies or measures that could affect the reproductive rights of women. It's of course important to consider these, and we're going to talk a little bit about why in the Myanmar context. But in the framing of the risk factors, they don't pay heed to men as reproductive agents or their reproductive rights. We kind of, we silo women into certain binaries, and I think it's important that we think about these. And something similar can be seen in the Holocaust Memorial Museum's report that contained a list of factors associated with increased risk of genocide, which has been translated into their museum's early warning project. There you have specific indicators such as trade openness as a potential risk factor for genocide, but there's not a single explicitly gendered risk factor. And I highlight these not to undermine the importance of these frameworks, but rather to point towards where very specifically a gendered perspective can concretely improve our ability to prevent conflict and atrocities. And I'm finally going to close with kind of something that Karen talked about, the importance of women's full, equal, and meaningful participation in this entire process. And this means everything from ensuring women's equal participation in peace processes and conflict resolution to political decision-making and to their involvement in policy development around atrocity prevention and response. For example, I always go back to CEDAW. I think, CEDAW to me is badly maligned, not as well understood as it should be. But the CEDAW committee, for example, has looked at this and noted that the low participation of women in institutions working on preventative diplomacy and on global issues such as military expenditures and nuclear disarmament, and how those, in addition to falling short of the convention, they actually cannot adequately predict and prevent conflict. And so that's why it's important to meaningfully include women in this. And this is something that really helps improve our arsenal. And I will say two final things. One, last week, 2 weeks ago was the official open debate on the 20th anniversary of 1325. And one of the clear calls that came through that debate was over 500 civil society organizations came through and said, one of the transformative things that can be done is for the UN to actually put in a requirement that says that in UN-led or co-led processes, they will not participate in those that don't include women in formal negotiation roles. And I think we need to be thinking about transformative ways like this that we can change women's participation. And finally, I want to conclude with an area where there's real progress. And that's where now, as of yesterday, our two special advisors on R2P and on genocide, Karen here, as well as our new advisor on genocide, Alice Nadirtu, are women. And women who have shown a commitment to incorporating a gender perspective into the work that they're doing. And we know how important feminist leadership is in helping to socialize these issues, especially in traditional patriarchal institutions and venues like the UN Security Council. So I personally am very excited about where we can go from here.
Thank you so much, Akila. Well said. I couldn't have said it better. As someone who actually implements the UN framework of analysis in her work. So thank you for that. I want to turn to Manai Lee. I want to specifically now talk about the situation in Myanmar. Why are ethnic minority women and girls particularly at risk of sexual violence from the Burmese army?
Thank you so much, Josila. Before I talking about the risk, I a little bit talk about the root cause of the conflict. So Burma gained independence from the British colony in 1948 and also formed federal unions of Burma. It is very based upon on the Panglong Agreement, which was signed in 1947. The ethnic minority dissatisfied with the unfair policy and administration of the central Burmese government. Since then, ethnic armed revolutionary groups were formed and ethnic people had been fighting for self-determination, ethnic equality, and freedom from the oppressive military dictatorship. For decades, the Burma army has invaded and occupied the ethnic lands to seize and exploit our rich natural resources. In Kachin State, at Pagan, you may know we have the highest quality jade in the world, which is earning billions of dollars for the Burma army generals and their cronies. Kachin State is now heavily militarized. 25 years ago, there were only 20 Burma Army battalions in our Kachin area. It is very the most northern Burma. Now there are over 200 battalions. This troop has license to commit atrocity with impunity against local ethnic people, including use of rape as a weapon of war. This means ethnic women and girls are under constant threat of sexual violence from these invading troops. So it is terrible situation happen in our Kachin area, not only in Kachin area, but also the other ethnic minority areas. Yes.
Back to Akila for a moment. Can you tell us how a gendered understanding of conflict prevention could have helped to prevent the Rohingya genocide, and how it may still help to prevent atrocities against ethnic minorities in Myanmar?
Sure. So I think Mon has very powerfully laid out what some of these root causes of conflict are, right? So let's think of the context of Myanmar, where you had over 60 years of rule by military junta, and in 2011 we saw an opportunity for democratic reform. But what happened in Myanmar was that instead of taking that opportunity to transform the society, we saw a more shallow approach to what development in Myanmar looked like. We saw large scale economic developments. Mon has highlighted what some of the natural resource extinction looks like. And instead, so we squandered an opportunity to address these root causes, including the gendered root causes. And so where we remain now is at a space where not just the Rohingya remain in a vulnerable position, but many of the ethnic minorities who have not seen a change as a result of this democratic transition. You've seen the decades of conflict, they've just continued. The peace process has entirely stalled. The consistent calls by women's civil society to end impunity for sexual violence against all ethnic minorities, pass a new violence against women law, it hasn't happened. And the international community in its own way has been complacent in this. We've been letting Myanmar off the hook too easily. And so I think that this is where what we really should see, and what we should have seen the stronger push on from the start, is the structural discrimination. So you brought up the context of the Rohingya, and I think let's talk a little bit about what those gendered causes are, right? So things that could have been focused on from the start, because these are things, some of them predated the transfer from the junta, things like policies that disenfranchise them and strip them of their citizenship, movement restrictions that of course have a gendered impact, reproductive rights restrictions, and to be fair, not all of these happened during the junta. In 2014, the parliament passed a series of race and religion laws, including one on population control. And these are ones that we should have seen a laser focus of the international community in demanding change on before they engaged in in so-called democratic reform, in development initiatives. And I think that this is where there was a massive failure of the responsibility to protect in Myanmar. And to be honest, it continues. We continue to see Myanmar be let off the hook for their failures. And so I know we'll talk a little bit more specifically about the ICJ case and what's going on, but I think that we need to be listening to the voices of people like Mon, who we didn't get to know, in the last 5 years, who we've been as an organization working with for 15 years, and who for decades have been demanding this of the United Nations with very little agency for and action taken on what they are recommending.
Thank you. Savita, I want to turn to you as someone who looks globally at gender and the responsibility to protect. What specifically should the international community do to ensure a holistic, consistent, and gender inclusive approach to upholding R2P?
Thanks, Jocelyn. And my response sort of builds on what Mon said and Karen said and what Akila said, in their responses. So going back to the question of sort of looking at through a gendered lens. So we strongly believe that, similar to focusing on marginalization of religious minorities, or inflammatory rhetoric targeting certain ethnic groups within a society, we need to consider extreme structural and institutional forms of gender inequality and targeted violence against women, as Akila said, as you said, and we have seen that in Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Myanmar, the case in point. And this is sort of this correlation, all of you talked about, that how this marginalization, this extreme marginalization, is a potential risk factor for mass atrocities, and that there's a definite correlation there. But yet early warning systems, as again, all of you said before, fall short of gender-specific indicators. And we have seen that, as Akila said, in different frameworks that we all use on a daily basis. And there's no really a systematic application of gender-sensitive monitoring or data collection. So for example, it has been observed that domestic violence tends to significantly increase before, during, and after violent conflict. Yet so far, little attention has been given to preserving indicators on how instability aggravates sexual violence on a family level. And I know this data is very hard to come by even in developed societies or conflict-free societies, but this is an important indicator. And others which you all mentioned, so other indicators include state-sanctioned gender-based discrimination, the level of prosecution for crimes committed against women. I mean, this is an important thing that otherwise, if there's a climate of impunity, or there is a sanctioning of gender-based violence against women at some level, and the level of female representation in high-level and private institutions. So these are all important indicators in itself. And putting greater emphasis on connecting these links and identifying diverse risk factors is crucial to understand the nature of violence that women will face, or how this violence can escalate. And without this understanding, we are failing in mitigating these risk factors. So in ongoing sort of atrocity situations, as well as post-conflict situations, it further remains central to address and highlight women's experience of atrocity crimes in particular, utilizing the knowledge of female experts and conducting gender-sensitive investigations, including through fact-finding missions or commissions of inquiry, can ensure that women's perspective and needs are discussed. Systematic application of gender perspective in peacekeeping missions or special political missions, both in terms of recruitment of personnel as well as with regards to the interactions with the communities, can bring about better results in terms of protection. Holding perpetrators of sexual violence to account is also vital to delivering justice to victims and to deter future crimes. And I won't talk a lot about accountability because I know Akila and Karen and Mon will talk about this in their later responses. But we must also remember that linking both R2P and WPS frameworks, as we have said, can only be realized if victims are, and again, as previous speakers have said, and that's sort of the problem with having such an eminent panel, because anything you want to say has already been said, is to not view women only as victims of violence, but powerful agents of change. For example, I mean, we have seen Nadia Murad, who has been an extremely important voice for the Yazidi community. And we don't see her as just a victim or a survivor, but as an advocate for justice for her community as a whole. So that's how we have to view women's role. And women affected by mass atrocities and violence and conflict around the world have always been and continue to be essential to mitigation strategies, and often are key actors of even securing humanitarian aid for their communities. We have seen this in CAR and Yemen across the board. As such, also women's rights organizations, or the work that Mon and her colleagues are doing, is often key to strengthening human rights implementation and hence enhancing resilience to atrocities. So, however, but in that context, only considering women as contributors to matter of peace and security locally remains a problem. Like, we have to bring women's voices, the voices of women like Mon and her colleagues and other women who are working in Myanmar and elsewhere, into the conversations at the national level and also at the international level. Increasing visibility of women in areas affected by violence, including through presence of female peace negotiators, peacekeepers, political representatives can also strengthen female leadership roles and provide an opportunity to build trust with local communities, and especially the women in those communities and victims of atrocities. Such trust is fundamental in the international community's capabilities and capacity to deliver on reconciliation, societal healing, and sustainable peace. Again, and here I also want to sort of highlight the fact that we don't need to look at women only as people who bring about peace, but also as perpetrators. So when I said earlier that it's important to consider particular experiences that women have during atrocities and how other women have dealt with them. And finally, while the inclusion of women in conflict resolution initiatives and post-crisis reconstruction has become the norm, that is particularly important but this is particularly important in situations where sexual violence is a defining feature of the violence. Women's agencies of fundamental importance to providing psychological support in atrocity-affected communities and empowering victims and survivors of gender-related crimes. Hence, stakeholders should focus on the use of experience, knowledge, and capacities to ensure full access, participation, and inclusion of women in preventive as well as responsive measures and strategies, and bring about local voices in any kind of contact or engagement with the community. So those are some of the ways in which the international community can holistically engage around WPS through an R2P lens, that is, including ways in which we do gendered analysis, how women's participation is reflected in this, and how women leadership is reflected in this. Thank you.
Thank you, Savita. One of the recommendations in this year's report by the Secretary General on the responsibility to protect calls for increasing efforts to end impunity, including for sexual and gender-based violence and crimes. Karen, in your view, how does this apply to Myanmar in terms of challenges and ways forward?
Thanks, Jocelyn. So I just want to start again by underlining that combating impunity and ensuring justice and accountability for atrocity crimes, including widespread or systematic sexual violence, is absolutely essential to advancing the responsibility to protect agenda in Myanmar. And we know from experience that effective accountability is not just important in terms of providing justice for the victims of atrocity crimes, but that it's equally important in deterring the reoccurrence. While, of course, on the other side, impunity for past crimes will contribute to potential future violations. And so maybe picking up on what Akila said, it's absolutely vital that the international community and the UN member states must use all of the available tools, from diplomacy to sanctions, to stop sexual violence by increasing the consequences of committing such crimes and holding perpetrators to account. And I also want to specifically, in relation to Myanmar, reiterate some of the recommendations from the 2019 Independent International Fact-Finding Mission report, which included a number of recommendations for the government of Myanmar. And I think it's really important that we keep reminding the government of this. And these included that they should ensure that reports of alleged sexual and gender-based violence by the Tatmadaw and other security personnel result in credible investigations and fair trials, that they need to undertake the necessary legislative reform to protect people of all genders, including children of all ethnic groups, from sexual and gender-based violence by effectively criminalizing in domestic law serious crimes under international law. And of course, these would include genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes, with civilian jurisdiction over these crimes. And also, really importantly, by providing redress and reparations to victims and survivors of sexual and gender-based violence. And finally, I think it's also really important to provide military and security personnel with mandatory training regarding sexual and gender-based violence. And we think of these as kind of basics, but if a government is not implementing them, the risks remain. And so the international community really needs to maintain pressure on Myanmar's government to implement these measures.
Thank you. Man Naili, back to you. How does the Kachin Women's Association support women survivors of state-sponsored violence in Myanmar? And what challenges do you and other human rights defenders face from the Burmese authorities when providing this support? And second, why is it not possible to access justice for state-sponsored sexual violence under Myanmar's legal system?
Yeah, thank you again. My organization is founded in 1999. Since then, we are working closely with the women, especially who are the conflict affected people. So my organization has set up safe houses for women survivors, including of sexual violence. We assist with medical support, counseling, and legal aid. But it is very difficult to find a lawyer who dare to help. We also provide livelihood support for survivors and their families. Unfortunately, some survivors are so traumatized that they suffer permanently mental problems. However, there is very little funding available for full service provision for survivors. When activists speak out about the case of the state-sponsored violence, we face security threat from the authority, including harassment, arrest, and imprisonment. The survivors and family members themselves sometimes end up being judged. For example, the father of a 14-year-old schoolgirl who was shot and killed by Tamador troops in Pagan. That was happened in since 2014 around that time. So, but her father charged for making a complaint to the Myanmar National Human Rights Commission. He was imprisoned for 2 years for making false accusation against the military. Most cases of sexual violence by government troops take place in remote areas. It is very far from any medical facility. So it is rare for a survivor to receive necessary medical care or access any medical test that can prove rape. Even if they can access a hospital, the staff are too afraid to release the evidence if they know that Burma Army is involved in the case. In the well-known case of the gang rape torture, murder of 2 Kachin volunteer teachers that happened in 2015, where all evidence pointed to the Tamador troops based in the village, medical staff were threatened by the military not to release evidence from the post-mortem examination. The army commander-in-chief himself publicly threatened to sue anyone who accused the military of involvement in this case. Until today, there has been completely impunity for this rape murder. It is very rare for cases to taken to the court because police do not want to accept that kind of case that involved by the military. Under the 2008 constitution, the police are under the Home Affairs Ministry, which is headed by the military. Lawyers are also afraid to take up cases against the military. Cases taken to court has been dismissed. For example, the case of Sumlut Raja, who was sexually assaulted and killed by the Burma army that happened in 2011, that the war started again in our Kachin area. Her family submitted her case to the Supreme Court that in the Naypyidaw in Burma, but it is that case also dismissed. So this kind of problem is ongoing happen in Burma. So it is very difficult to find the justice for the survivor.
Thank you so much for giving that really in-depth insight onto what's happening domestically. Akila, I want to turn to you because we want to also think about international justice and accountability. But how? What role does international justice and accountability, including for gender crimes, play in preventing atrocity crimes? How does this apply to Myanmar, for example?
Thanks, Jocelyn. And Karen and Mon have really made this quite easy for me. So I think, as a starting point, we've discussed a lot about the importance of individual accountability, that of those who are the direct perpetrators, those who are the commanders, the classic modes of criminal accountability. And Mon has really laid out powerfully why that is so difficult domestically in Myanmar. This is something that has been consistently raised by women's civil society, is that justice is not possible within the domestic system without significant reforms to the Constitution, without significant legislative reforms. And so I think it's actually, we should talk a little bit about state accountability, because we often focus on the accountability of the individual and we ignore the accountability of the state. And there's a couple of places where in Myanmar this is really relevant. So I think the first place is, of course, with the human rights treaty bodies, that what they do with their reviews, the UPR, these are modes of holding a state accountable for their systematic failures. The UPR of Myanmar is coming up, and I think it's a really important opportunity for states to actually make strong recommendations on what Myanmar should be doing to prevent atrocities from happening to address the root causes of conflict, to change the systems that ensure impunity for the military. The CEDAW committee in their reviews has consistently engaged on these issues, particularly with a gender perspective, looking at issues such as impunity for sexual violence. The second is, of course, one of the more exciting things to happen in the space of international justice and accountability, which is the case of the ICJ. And I want to discuss this in two dimensions. I think the first is we often focus on this very importantly, as the ICJ case is a question of Myanmar's own responsibility to prevent genocide, because the case isn't just about the commission of genocide, it's actually about their failures to prevent and punish genocide as well. And so it's about looking at, what has Myanmar done as a state party to the Genocide Convention to prevent these things from happening in the first place. And in January of this year, the ICJ ordered provisional measures that recognize that the risk is ongoing. And what that means is that Myanmar is under a continuous obligation to do something to prevent these things from reoccurring. Because whether for the Rohingya or whether for other ethnic groups, leaving the ICJ case slightly aside, the risk factors of atrocities remain. Conflict remains, conflict is intensifying. And so I think that pushing the government to take solid measures to address these root causes is the only way to diminish the risk and prevent genocide and other mass atrocities from happening. The second piece that I want to talk about that I think gets left off a little bit in this prevention conversation is that the ICJ case is actually Gambia affecting its own obligations to prevent genocide, because that is a part of R2P and it's underlined by these binding legal obligations. Every state party has an obligation to prevent genocide. And what Gambia is demonstrating is something that's important, which is that there are a range of tools in the arsenal of international law that could be used to create the pressure to effectuate your own obligations to do something about atrocities when they happen. R2P often gets mired in these conversations of humanitarian intervention, and it ends up in circles because that's where we end up. But the ICJ case to me is a really powerful reminder of peaceful, it's the Pacific, the settlement of conflict and of disputes, right? There are tools in our arsenal that are not humanitarian intervention that could be used if states are willing to step up, think creatively, think boldly, and put themselves out there to do it. And, this is, I think, in the context of Myanmar, where we are nowhere near a resolution, this is what we need to see and not the business as usual that we've seen.
Thank you, Akila. And I think you're really emphasizing an important thing for the folks who are listening today and thinking about genocide as processional, as a process, not as an event, and cyclical in nature. And therefore, the opportunities for prevention continue. And that brings me to our next question to Karen. The Rohingya remain at risk, and other groups, the Kachin groups as well, remain at risk of atrocity crimes and conflict related to sexual violence. including trafficking, sexual exploitation, and refugee camps in Bangladesh. What are the main barriers to overcoming challenges and ensuring the Rohingya and others are fully protected?
Thanks, Jocelyn. Yeah, I mean, this is something which is of great concern, I think, and should be of great concern to all of us. It's not just the situation of the Rohingya inside Myanmar, but what is happening in Bangladesh and in the refugee camps. And there's an increased risk, I think, of intercommunal tensions between the host community and the refugee community, and that has all kinds of implications that we really should be paying much more attention to. Now, in terms of the challenges that you mentioned, as I mentioned in an earlier response, the issue of accountability for sexual and gender-based violence continues to be a big challenge. And again, as the independent international fact-finding mission noted, no senior Tatmadaw officer has yet been held accountable for widespread sexual and gender-based violence against the Rohingya. And also the government of Myanmar has yet to show the necessary political will to effectively address the systematic nature of sexual and gender-based violence. And I also just wanted to point out, as Akila has noted, gender inequality is part of underlying structural conditions that provide the foundation of patterns of violence that can lead to the commission of atrocity crimes. And I was also, again, reminded by what Man described of how we see ethnic women and girls being doubly victimized, firstly as women and girls, and secondly as members of ethnic communities. And then when they find themselves in refugee camps, you could say that that presents a third kind of risk factor. So this is really very concerning. And so in overcoming these challenges, we simply have to step up collective efforts to ensure the dignity and the well-being of the Rohingya. And this means working towards lasting solutions in Myanmar itself, but also following up on what Akila has just said in terms of accountability and justice. It also includes third country pathways for those with the most acute vulnerabilities, including the victims of sexual violence. But ultimately, if we're talking about lasting solutions, these must address the root causes of discrimination and violence. And these efforts, again, must include the voices of the Rohingya and, most importantly, the Rohingya women.
Thank you. And still on you, Karen, how do you think the responsibility to protect and the women, peace, and security agendas can be mutually enforcing?
I think Savita has done such a great job in talking about this, so I don't have much more to add to that. But I just want to again emphasize that for me, the most important element of linking the women, peace and security, and the R2P agenda is to really highlight the vital role of women in the prevention of atrocity crimes and as agents of protection. And we've seen, especially in compiling the report for this year, there were so many examples of women's important contributions to early warning, conflict resolution, peace operations, peace building, and also justice and accountability. And of course, we also know that women face many, many challenges. But despite their underrepresentation, we see them displaying immense leadership in many parts of the world, which I think is very encouraging. And as others have said, we know that involving women in these processes are absolutely fundamental to ensuring sustainable peace. And again, this means that member states need to step up their efforts. And so in terms of effective implementation of the responsibility to protect, this requires two steps. First, to recognize and put women at the center of conflict and atrocity prevention, peacemaking, peace building, and mediation efforts. And second, to identify the obstacles that prevent their participation in decision-making and representation in atrocity prevention efforts. And so this, for me, underlines a clear synergy between the responsibility to protect and the women, peace, and security agendas.
And Savita, I want to ask you, what 2 or 3 things would you want states and the United Nations to prioritize to implement the R2P and WPS agendas?
I think to begin with, just to say that, the international accountability efforts are extremely, extremely important, and states need to step up, and not only in the context of their responsibility within multilateral organizations, but the example of Gambia in terms of holding a country responsible for the violation of genocide convention. So that's an important step, and it shows a way that a country is upholding its R2P. But in the context of sort of the WPS and R2P agenda, I would say that one, all UN security sanctions committees should expand designation criteria for individuals who perpetrate sexual violence in the context of armed conflict. Second, training on gender sensitivity, preventing sexual exploitation, and identifying and responding to indicators of conflict-related sexual violence should be mandatory component of national military and police training, as well as pre-deployment and in-mission training for all UN peacekeeping and civilian personnel. Third, survivor-centric approaches prioritize the rights and the needs of victims of sexual and gender-based violence. The international community should provide appropriate medical, psychosocial, and socio-economic reintegration support in order to restore the social fabric of societies after conflicts. And we have seen the lack of this, how it has affected the Yazidi women across the board. And finally, Karen spoke about this and others have spoken about this. It is important to emphasize that all the measures that we have discussed throughout this conversation about systematically applying the gender lens to R2P policies, it's not about one size fits all. Gender sensitivity remains inherently context specific, and women themselves need to be able to design and implement their own strategies. To emphasize the point further, I would just like to say, think in terms of communities of concern, teachers, midwives, women who have political and social capital within their communities, have intrinsic and organic links to those communities and know best which prevention and mitigation strategies can be most effective. Hence, rather than just imposing outside strategies or cookie cutter strategies and policies, the international community and all of us who work on this must listen better and must listen to activists and like Moen and others in the diaspora to understand what is it that they actually need and how to sort of think about prevention as well as response in a context specific way, not just sort of these principles and ideas that we have and take for granted. So that's where I would like to stop, that increased participation and think in terms of gender sensitivity in all the variables that we deal with. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Savita. And in terms of listening to our activists on the ground, I want to, as a moderator, I know we're right at time at 10, but I want to go a little beyond the hour if you'll allow us to give Man the last word. How do you feel about the current peace process in Myanmar, Man? And what do you think the international community should be doing to prevent the ongoing atrocities against ethnic minorities by the Burmese army?
Yeah, current peace process will never bring peace because many conflict actors are excluded, and the Burma army is blocking any dialogue toward meaningful federal reforming. And also, the central government is just using the peace process to show to the international community why the Burma army carry on launching large-scale ground and air attack on the ethnic people in ceasefire and non-ceasefire area that committing atrocity and displacing hundreds of thousands. The current peace process is similar to what we Kachin experienced, that is 17 years experience of the ceasefire agreement. The Kachin independent organization signed a ceasefire in 1994, but there was never any political dialogue, and the Burma army just expanded into the Kachin area, finally breaking the ceasefire in 2011 and resuming full-scale conflict. That the conflict happened again in our Kachin area. The atrocity will never end until the military is brought under civilian control and there is genuine peace under a new federal constitution, giving ethnic people control over our own land and resources. The government has no sincere toward ending the atrocity. They deny sexual violence by their troops, Tamado, because we can say that the Government Independent Commission of Inquiry, ICOE, reports into crimes in Northern Rakhine State. They found no credible statement on allegation of gang rape by Myanmar's security forces. It is terrible, so we are really shocked to hearing that their report. So that's why we want meaningful pressure from the international community. It is really important. The community pressure is to make changing our federal union in our country again, and also a meaningful, peaceful process in our country. We are calling for an end to business as usual with Burma and stop and review to all international aid to or under the government. The government has used the COVID-19 crisis to raise over $1 billion in aid and loan from the World Bank, ADB, IMF, and also JICA. And last month, the US also sent a high-level delegation to Burma to promote investment, promising billions of dollars. This is giving a green light to military's atrocity. We want donors to resume aid to refugee and IDP on the Thai-Burma border, and also to give aid directly cross-border to IDP in northern Burma. That is to fulfill their basic needs until there is a negotiated peace accord, and they can return home voluntarily and safety and with dignity to their original home. Since last year, the Burmese government has been organizing for Kachin IDP to return home and raising funds from international donors for this. In Kachin State, some families have returned under this plan to unsafe location. That place is next to the Burma Army camp, where they are vulnerable to abuse by Burma Army troops. And where they are, there is also still existing landmine. In February, one of the returning IDP was injured by a landmine. That kind of cases, a lot of cases happen in the ground. Foreign donors have supported this returning IDP with food, education, and livelihood support at a much higher rate than in the IDP camp. This is creating a pull factor for IDP to return, because they can barely, survive on very low level of aid in the IDP camp, especially since the COVID lockdown, which has blocked them from walking outside the camp. Right now, most Kachin IDP just get 11,000 kyat. It is similar to the $8. It is for one person, it is per month for food. I want to add donors to ensure that the IDP in the camp receive adequate ration so that they are not being forced to return to their villages just in order to get enough food despite the lack of safety. And also we add donor to stop support for the current fair, peace process and to pressure the Burmese government and military to end all offensive through the country, pull back all their troops so that a new inclusive peace process can begin, and also we can form the federal democracy in Burma. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Man. And thank you to all of our speakers today, Akila, Savita, and Karen, and you, Man. am so sorry to the audience. We are well past the hour and I want to be respectful of the time. So we don't have time for the questions that are in the Q&A. And there were several that were very interesting, but I apologize for going past the hour. But I do think, and I hope that the conversation was interesting, compelling, and worthwhile despite the Q&A end time. So thank you to everyone. Thank you to the Global Justice Center and the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect. And thanks to all who came and participated today. And we wish you well.
And thanks to you, Jocelyn, for moderating.
Thank you, Jocelyn. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.